Spring 1886, Pecos River, Texas, New Mexico border. The wind had changed. Caleb Rourke felt it before the clouds got heavy. He was working the north fence with Ben, hammering a fresh cedar post into ground, still cracked from last summer's drought, when the air shifted cooler, sharper, smelling of wet mesquite. Upstream, the Pecos ran high and fast brown water, rolling like the back of a restless steer. Caleb leaned on the post driver, squinting at the horizon. Storm coming hard. In his palm, he turned over a smooth, river-worn stone, no bigger than a dove's egg, shaped like a teardrop. He kept it in his pocket, more out of habit than woodsy. "Thing about this stone, Ben," he said, holding it out for his boy to see, "is it's been through a dozen floods. Might have rolled for miles. But it's still here. Still whole. River'll take most things away. Not this." Ben, 12 and itching to be anywhere but mending fence, just nodded. "Guess it's lucky." Caleb slipped the stone back in his pocket. "Ain't luck, it's just stubborn." A low growl of thunder rolled in from the west. Then the wind slapped the grass flat, carrying the first cold drops. Caleb tightened the post wire. "Let's finish this stretch before the Pa." Ben cut in, pointing downriver. At first Caleb saw nothing but the swirling current. Then the shape came into focus, a freight wagon, half turned in the water, the front wheels caught on a hidden sandbar. Two figures clung to the wreck, one grown, one small. The grown one was waving an arm half submerged, the river yanking at them, like it meant to pull them under. "Hell," Caleb muttered. He scanned the bank. No one else in sight. "Ben, ride home. Get the coil rope off the barn wall. Tell Jenkins next door there's folks in the water." Ben's eyes flicked between the wreck and his father. "What about you? I'll go down. Now move." Ben kicked his pony into a run, the hooves tearing up wet turf. Caleb vaulted the fence boots, slipping in the fresh mud, as he made for the river. Rain sheeted sideways now, needling his face. The current was worse up close, angry, swirling around the splintered wagon box. The woman's head jerked as she spotted him, her eyes wide under a plaster of wet hair. She clutched something to her chest with one arm, a canvas satchel darkened with water, while keeping the smaller figure's head above the churn with the other. "Hold on," Caleb shouted, though the river likely stole the words. He waited in the cold, biting through denim and into bone. Every step was a fight. Silt sucked at his boots, and the pull of the current was near enough to knock him sideways. He reached the wagon. The smaller figure, a girl maybe 9, was shivering, lips blue. The woman's grip on her was iron. "Pass her to me," Caleb barked. The woman hesitated, eyes flaring with something, fear or pride, or both. Then she let him take the girl. Caleb hauled her up against his shoulder, turned back toward the bank. A voice carried over the roar, "Ben's." Pa roped. Caleb glanced over his shoulder to see his boy on the bank, the coil already looped over one arm, the other end tied fast to his pony's saddle horn. Ben threw the line, the wet hemp smacking Caleb across the chest. Caleb hooked it under his arm, wrapped a turn around the girl, and let the river push them toward shore. Boots found gravel, then mud. Ben grabbed the girl, half dragging her up the slope. Caleb turned back for the woman. She was still clinging to the wagon satchel in a death grip. "Let go," he shouted. "Can't," she gasped. Caleb swore, lunged for her arm. The satchel swung between them, heavy as if it held rocks. He didn't ask, just yanked her free. The current slammed them sideways, but the rope held. 2 more steps and Ben was there again, helping drag her onto the grass. They collapsed on the bank, rain still coming in on sheets. The girl crawled to her mother's side, wrapping both arms around her. Caleb stood, breathing hard, rain running into his eyes. Up close, she was younger than he'd guessed, about 30, maybe a touch more. Dress torn at the hem, boots split near the toes. Face pale but steady, even with her breath still ragged. "You hurt?" Caleb asked. She shook her head. "No, she's fine." Her voice was rough, as if she hadn't used it in days. Then, we just need a dry place for the night. That's all. Caleb looked toward the low ridge, where his barn sat dark against the storm sky. Barn's dry enough if you don't mind company that chews hay. I don't, she said. We'll keep out of the way. Ben stood nearby, eyes darting between them. I'll take him up. Pa, Caleb nodded. The boy led the pair toward the barn, the little girl's hand tucked in his. Later, when the worst of the rain had passed, Caleb brought 2 wool blankets and a lantern to the barn. He set them just inside the door. There's water in the tin by the wall. Feed sacks'll be softer than the boards. She nodded, once eyes on the lantern flame. Thank you. Caleb tipped his hat and stepped back into the night. The rain had eased, but the Pecos still growled in the dark. If this story finds a place in your heart, pull up a chair by the fire and subscribe to Wild West Drama to ride with us on the next trail ahead. And now, let's let the wind and the dust do the talking. The morning broke slow, as if the land itself was sore from the storm. A pale sun pushed through a thin veil of cloud, lighting the damp yard in a soft gray. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, coffee steaming in his hand, and let the quiet settle. The air smelled of wet sage and turned earth, the kind of clean that only comes after a hard rain. The barn door eased open. Nora Flynn stepped out first, her dress patched in places where the thread didn't quite match the fabric. The hem was frayed, mud-spattered from the riverbank. Her hands, bare now, were rough and reddened. The knuckles thickened like someone used to work. Cora followed close, her small hand holding the doorframe for balance. Her hair was neatly plaited into 2 braids tied at the ends with fraying bits of ribbon. Caleb noticed that, storm or no storm, Nora kept the girl tidy. Ben came around from the side yard with an apple in one hand, half eaten. He stopped when he saw Cora, hesitated, then held out the remaining half without a word. The girl glanced up at her mother. Nora gave the smallest nod. Cora stepped forward, took the apple and bit in. Ben grinned like he had just won a hand of cards. Caleb sipped his coffee, watching the exchange. He'd seen his boy share plenty before, jerky biscuits, even his favorite pocket knife once, but never with that kind of quiet care. You can stay a day or 2, Caleb said finally, his voice carrying across the yard. Till the river drops. After that, I'll see you to the road. Nora looked over at him, face unreadable. That'll be enough. He nodded and turned toward the corral, figuring that would be the end of it. But when he came back half an hour later, she was sweeping the porch with an old broom that leaned against the wall. That's not necessary, he said. I know. She didn't look up. The broom rasped against the boards, pushing a neat pile of leaves toward the steps. By midday, she had stacked the wood pile by the side of the house, the logs set tight and even. Caleb wasn't sure when she'd found the time, but the job was done better than he'd have bothered. The sound of hoofbeats carried in from the road. Caleb glanced up to see a chestnut mare trot into the yard. Sheriff Amos Keene in the saddle. Amos was older than Caleb by a few years, with a face like sun-cracked leather and eyes that missed nothing. Morning, Caleb. Amos swung down, dusted his hat on his thigh. Heard we had company out this way. Caleb set down the feed bucket. River washed him in. Amos's gaze shifted to the barn, where Cora was perched on the fence rail, watching a pair of hens scratch at the dirt. That her? Caleb nodded once. Amos lowered his voice. Name's Flynn, right? Came up in Pecos City a year back. Her husband ran with Rustler's Miller gang, if memory serves. Bank foreclosed on their spread after he got himself shot in the leg and disappeared. Caleb kept his eyes on the corral post he was tightening. That's so. Don't know if it's true, Amos went on, but folks say she knows how to keep bad company. Might be trouble sticking around. Appreciate the warning, Caleb said evenly. Amos studied him for a beat, then shrugged. You always were hard-headed. I'll be in town if you need anything. After the sheriff rode off, Caleb stood for a while in the yard, the wind lifting the smell of damp hay from the barn. He didn't like gossip, never had. But Amos wasn't the sort to pass along campfire lies. Still looking toward the garden patch out back, he saw Nora bent over the rows, working with a tin pail in hand. She was watering the soil slow and steady, like each plant mattered. Cora had traded her place on the fence for the henhouse, where she helped Ben gather eggs into a wicker basket. The boy showed her how to check for cracks, and she nodded solemnly, before tucking each egg into the straw. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, coffee gone cold in his hand. He didn't call out to them, didn't step closer, just watched. The girl laughed at something Ben said, the sound light and quick, then glanced toward her mother. Nora looked up, caught Caleb watching, and straightened. For the barest moment, their eyes held hers, steady, measuring. Then she went back to her work without a word. Caleb stayed where he was, the boards beneath him still faintly damp from the rain. He wasn't sure yet whether the river had brought him trouble or something else entirely. The next morning carried the cool, dust-scented calm that came after a hard rain. Caleb hitched the buckboard early, a few steers roped and tied behind, for the sale in San Miguel. Ben clambered up beside him, eager for the ride. From the barn's shadow, Nora stepped forward, her hands clasped around a small cloth purse. "Need flour," she said simply. Caleb hesitated, then jerked his chin toward the wagon's empty bench. She climbed up. Without another word, skirts gathered neatly, the morning light catching on the faint weariness under her eyes. Cora, still in the doorway, waved until they were out of sight. The road into San Miguel was rutted from the storm, the Pecos still swollen and brown in the distance. They passed wind-bent cottonwoods, a few bedraggled longhorns picking at wet grass. Caleb kept his gaze ahead, but he was aware of her beside him, silent, hands folded in her lap, scanning the horizon like she was measuring it for trouble. They reached town by mid-morning, the sun breaking through in silver-edged shards. San Miguel was small, but busy, a string of weathered storefronts. A blacksmith hammering somewhere down the alley, the smell of yeast and leather on the breeze. Caleb sold the steers quick, the jingle of coins slipping into his pocket with the easy weight of work well done. When they stepped into Dorsey's General for flour, Maggie Dorsey herself stood behind the counter, a wide-hipped woman with eyes that missed nothing. She looked up from the ledger, her gaze landing square on Nora. "Well now," Maggie said, voice slow as molasses, "been a while since I saw you. Nora Flynn." Nora's posture didn't shift. "Just here for flour, Maggie." But Maggie's eyes traveled from her boots to her hair and back again. A smile crept up one side of her face, the kind that wasn't about kindness. "Shame about your man," she said, not quite under her breath, but just soft enough to pretend she wasn't aiming it at anyone in particular. "Died in that rustler camp last winter, didn't he? Lost the ranch to the bank right after. Hard business." From the corner of his eye, Caleb saw Nora's shoulders tighten. She didn't answer. He set his hands on the counter, flat and steady, and said, "We'll take 2 sacks. And quick." Maggie shrugged, moving to fetch the flour, but as she passed another customer, Caleb caught the whisper, "Traveling with Rourke now. Guess some folks don't mind a tarnished name." He felt the shift in the room then, like dust rising in still air. A pair of old ranch hands looked their way, murmuring. Someone at the back laughed low. Caleb ignored them, but the skin between his shoulders prickled all the same. They left without speaking, the flour sacks stacked in the wagon bed. On the ride out, the sound of town faded, replaced by the soft squeak of the wagon boards and the creak of leather harness. Ben, sitting in back, whittled at a stick with his pocket knife. Nora kept her gaze forward, her face carved from the same stone as the hills they passed. By the time they reached the homestead, the afternoon light was laying itself in warm stripes across the yard. Ben and Cora disappeared toward the riverbank, returning with an armload of driftwood Sun-bleached boards, knotty branches, even a cracked wagon wheel. "We're building a fort," Ben announced, and Cora nodded solemnly, as if they'd been sworn to some sacred mission. Caleb busied himself with the tack in the barn, but the sound of laughter drifted over the yard, bright clear. At first he thought it was the children. Then he heard it again, warmer, fuller. Nora. He turned slightly, catching sight of her crouched beside the half-built fort, one hand steadying a leaning board, while Cora pounded at it with a small mallet. Her head tipped back at something Ben said, and the laugh came again, unguarded, uncalculated. Caleb realized with a faint ache that it had been years since he'd heard a woman laugh like that on his land. Later, when the fort stood lopsided but proud, Caleb wandered over, hands in his pockets. Cora was tracing a crooked doorway into the dirt with a stick. "Your pa would have liked this," he said lightly. "You remember him much?" Cora looked up, eyes bright with the openness of a child who still believes questions are just questions. "A little," she started. Nora's voice cut in firm but not unkind. "He's gone. That's enough." Cora blinked, then went back to her drawing. The moment hung there a beat longer, heavy, with something Caleb didn't press. He'd seen it before, the way certain wounds never closed all the way some pasts weren't for sharing. The sun was dropping low, the air cooling. He stood there a while, watching the two girls rearrange scraps of wood into what they decided was a roof. The laughter came again, softer this time, carried on the wind like something he didn't know he'd missed until it returned. And for the first time since the river brought them, Caleb let himself wonder, not if they'd leave when the water fell, but if he'd even want them to. The morning broke hard and bright, the kind that made the cottonwoods along the Pecos stand out like silver ghosts against the sky. Caleb was in the corral, working a skittish roan, when the sound of hoofbeats rolled up from the south trail. Not the lazy rhythm of a neighbor calling in. This was faster, purposeful. A rider came into view, lean and long-legged in the saddle dust billowing behind him. He reined up hard at the gate, the horse blowing steam into the crisp air. The man wore a weathered coat, but his boots were too clean, his hat tipped forward, like he meant to hide something more than his eyes. "Zeke Maris, Caleb," said his voice flat as the plains. He didn't need an introduction. He'd heard the name from Nora once, in a tone that carried both history and warning. Zeke swung down, slow dust settling around him. "Got business," he said, patting the side of his coat until his hand found a folded packet of papers. "From the law in Pecos City. Figured I'd bring it myself." From the porch, Nora appeared, skirts brushing the wood. Her face went pale, but her eyes stayed fixed on Zeke. "This here," Zeke went on, unfolding the papers with a kind of smug care, "is the debt ledger from Flynn Ranch, your folks' place. Bank never did get all they were owed. And this," he pulled out another sheet creased and yellowed, "is a power of attorney signed by me, on account of my being next of kin to poor Thomas Flynn, God rest him. Means I got the right to settle what's left of the debt." Caleb stepped up to the fence, his shadow cutting across the gate. "State your point." "My point," Zeke said, grinning like a man with the winning hand, "is that little girl yonder." He jerked his chin toward the barn, where Cora was sitting in the doorway plaiting twine into a rope. "Is worth something to me. She comes back with me, debt's cleared. Easiest way to square accounts." Nora's voice came sharp, steady. "She's not yours to take." Zeke shrugged. "Blood's blood, and paper's paper." Caleb's voice dropped low, slow the way a storm lowers before it breaks. "You're on my land, Morris. You'll leave, now." Zeke looked him over from the worn leather gloves to the squared stance. "You can puff up all you like, Rourke, but I'll be back with the law this time. See how tough you stand then." He turned, swung into the saddle. The horse sidestepped, sensing the tension. "Ain't nothing you can do'll change the fact that she's coming with me." Caleb didn't move. "I'll change it by not letting you cross this gate again." Zeke's smile thinned, But he said nothing more, riding off toward the southern horizon until the dust swallowed him whole. The yard was still for a long beat after. A hawk cried somewhere above the sound, cutting sharp through the quiet. Nora turned on Caleb, fire in her eyes. You think I'm some burden you've got to guard, another mouth to feed until it's easier to let us go? He met her gaze without flinching. I don't keep the weak. Her brows knitted. Then what do you think you're doing? I stand with those worth fighting for, he said, each word measured. Her breath caught, not from softness, but from the weight of what she heard there. She looked away, first her jaw tight, and walked toward the barn without another word. Ben had been in the shadow of the porch, small and silent, eyes wide from the exchange. He slipped down the steps and crossed to where Nora stood in the doorway, her hand on the latch. Miss Nora, he said, voice thin. Are they going to take Cora away? She knelt, pulling him into a hug so tight he felt the steady beat of her heart. Not today, she whispered. Not yet. From the yard, Caleb heard the words but pretended not to. He stood at the fence, staring at the trail where Zizi had vanished, the taste of iron ant dust still sharp in his mouth. And in his mind, he was already weighing what kind of fight this would be, and how far he'd go to keep it. The rain had been steady for 3 days, the kind that turns dirt roads into black ribbon and makes the Pecos swell with a voice you can hear in your bones. In San Miguel's saloon, the lamplight spilled gold across wet boots and wet tempers. Zeke Maris sat at a corner table with the Cole brothers, Tom and Luke, men built like fence posts. Left too long in the sun faces, hardened eyes quick and narrow. They drank in silence at first, but soon the low rumble of their talk carried. Word spread easy in a small town, and by sundown, the whispers were all the same. The Coles had history with Caleb Rourke. Hired hands once before Caleb caught them running a few unbranded steers through the north pasture. They'd left in disgrace, their names blackened in every cattle outfit from here to Roswell. By the time Sheriff Amos Keene found Caleb the next morning, the rain was still falling in curtains the color of lead. Amos reined up at the Rourke gate, water dripping from his hat brim. Heard the Cole boys are keeping company with Morris, the sheriff said. That's not the kind of trouble you leave on the porch. Caleb wiped the rain from his jaw. They want something, they'll have to cross my fence to get it. Amos studied him a moment, then shook his head. Watch yourself, Caleb. Cole brothers don't take well to being shamed. And Maris, he'll stir any pot he can. The warning settled in Caleb's gut like a cold stone, but the work didn't stop for bad weather. By the 4th morning, the lower pasture was near a swamp, and the Pecos was running high and mean. Caleb saddled up with Ben, driving the herd toward higher ground before the floodplain swallowed them whole. The rain stung their faces, the wind cutting sideways. They pushed the cattle up a muddy rise, the river's roar growing louder with every step. Ben, trying to keep pace, swung wide near the edge, where the bank crumbled slick underfoot. His boot slipped. Then Caleb's shout barely cut through the storm. From across the pasture, Nora had been carrying a pail toward the barn when she saw the boy slide. She dropped it, without thinking. The handle clattered against the mud as she ran, skirts heavy, breath sharp in the cold air. Ben's feet went out from under him, his hands scrabbling for a hold on the slick clay. The water below was a churning brown fury. Caleb was a stride away when Nora reached him first, throwing herself down flat, gripping the boy's wrist with both hands. The strain wrenched her shoulder, white pain flashing through her vision, but she held on, dragging him inch by inch until Caleb could hook an arm around them both and pull them clear. They lay in the wet grass, all three gasping, the rain drumming relentless. Caleb's hand went to Nora's arm, steadying her as she tried to push up. She winced. Shoulder she managed, teeth clenched. He didn't waste time. He got Ben to his feet, then slipped his arm around Nora's back, guiding her toward the house. She leaned into him, not from choice, but because her knees threatened to give out. Inside, the fire was quick to catch heat, blooming against the damp chill. Caleb eased her into a chair, then knelt to work her arm free of the soaked sleeve. The joint was swollen, the skin warm under his calloused fingers. "This'll hurt," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "Do it." A quick pull and shift her breath hissed through her teeth, but the bone settled back into place. Caleb bound the shoulder with a strip of clean cloth, his hands steady, his focus absolute. Ben hovered nearby, still pale. "Thank you," he said, voice small, but it was to Nora, not his father. She managed a faint smile. "Don't make a habit of scaring people like that." The rain eased to a soft patter by nightfall. Caleb stayed by her bed, the lamplight warm on the walls. She lay propped on pillows, the fire's glow catching in her hair. "You didn't think," he said at last. "No," she replied. "I just saw him fall." They were quiet a long time, the only sound the ticking of the stove. Then, as if the walls had loosened something, Caleb spoke. "When Sarah died, I thought I had done all this losing a man could bear. But it's not just the people, is it? It's the way the house sounds different. The way you don't hear certain laughter anymore." Nora's eyes softened. "I know. For me it was when my father passed, then Thomas. Each time the land felt bigger, but not in a good way." He looked at her then, not as a stranger in need of shelter, but as someone who understood a kind of quiete too heavy to name. Outside, the Pecos rolled on, full and restless, but in that small room, the air held steady. The fight with Maris and the Coles was still out there waiting, but tonight it could wait one more day. By mid-morning, the rain had gone, leaving the land smelling of wet mesquite and clean mud. The Pecos still ran high, but the air was lighter, and the clouds broke in long strips of pale blue. Caleb was mending a hinge on the barn door when Nora said she'd ride into San Miguel. "Only if you need salt," she told him, tucking a stray wisp of hair beneath her kerchief. "Won't be long." The town was quiet when she arrived. Wagons stood wheel-deep in drying ruts, and the wind carried the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from somewhere behind Main Street. Nora tied up outside the mercantile and stepped in, the bell over the door giving a tired ring. She had just paid for the salt when voices drifted in from the alley beside the store. Something in the tone, low, deliberate, made her pause. She slipped out the side door, the sack of salt pressed to her chest, and edged toward the sound. It was Zeke Maris, his hat pushed back, leaning against a post. Facing him were Tom and Luke Cole, both holding tin cups that steamed in the cool air. "Paper says it's mine to act on," Zeke was saying. "We get him in front of a judge in Pecos City, he's finished. Bank takes the land, sells it off. I'll split the cattle with you boys." Luke gave a humorless chuckle. Caleb Rourke in a courtroom, "I'd pay to see it." Tom spat into the dirt. "Better move quick. Man's got a way of turning folks against you if you wait too long." Zeke's eyes narrowed. "We ride out tomorrow. Show the paper, give him a choice, sell now or face the law. Either way, we walk off richer." Nora stayed pressed to the wall until their voices faded down the alley. Her first thought was simple and sharp: take Cora and run. There was no law strong enough to keep men like that from prying open a life if they wanted it bad enough. She imagined the road south, the weight of her daughter's hand in hers, and no more second chances to look back. But the picture of Ben's pale face by the river's edge came just as fast. And Caleb standing in the rain, steadying her when her knees had given. She owed him more than silence. By the time she rode back to the ranch, her decision was made. She found Caleb in the yard, sleeves rolled, sweat on his brow, despite the cool air. "They're coming tomorrow," she told him, and repeated every word she'd overheard. Caleb listened without interruption, only the faint tightening of his jaw showing through. When she was done, he glanced toward the horizon where the sun burned low and gold. Ben and I'll ride to town. Amos needs to hear this before they do. Maybe I should take Cora somewhere. He shook his head. They'll smell fear on the wind. Best you stay where I can see you. Ben saddled his pony with quick, nervous hands. Pa, they won't take the land, will they? Not while I'm breathing, Caleb said. By the time the boy was astride, the light was falling fast. Caleb sent him hard toward San Miguel, the sound of hooves fading into the open country. The next morning, dust rose on the southern road. Zeke Maris rode in first, the Cole brothers close behind. They drew up at the gate, their horses restless under them. Zeke swung down, pulling a folded packet from his coat. Paper from Pecos City says, I've got authority over what's owed. Means the girl comes with me, or you sell the place to square the ledger. Caleb stood just inside the yard, hands easy at his sides. This is my land. That's not changing because you wave paper at it. Tom Cole stepped forward, jaw tight. Then we'll bring someone who can make it change. Before Caleb could answer, the thud of hooves came from the north. Sheriff Amos Keene rode in. At a steady clip, Ben just behind him. The lawman dismounted, taking the paper from Zeke's hand before the man could protest. Amos looked it over once, twice, then folded it slow. This here's no legal claim. Signed by a man who's been dead 6 months, and witnessed by another doing time in Yuma. You try to act on it, you'll be the ones facing a judge. Zeke's face darkened. You think you can? I can. Amos cut in, his voice like a dry snap of mesquite. Now get off this land before you find yourself locked up for attempted fraud. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Luke tugged his reins and the Cole brothers wheeled their horses. Zeke spat into the dust but followed. They rode out the way they'd come, the sound of hooves fading to nothing. Amos handed the paper to Caleb. Best burn that. When the sheriff left, the yard felt wider, quieter. Nora stood in the doorway, Cora's hand in hers, watching the road. They'll be back, she said softly. Caleb met her eyes. Then we'll be ready. The dust from Zeke Maris and the Cole brothers still hung faint in the air, long after their silhouettes had faded over the ridge. No apologies, no backward glance, just the sound of hooves swallowed by the horizon. The threat had peaked for now, but the land held a hush that felt less like peace and more like the pause before the wind shifts. Caleb stood at the edge of the yard, watching the empty road. His hands were on his hips, but there was no fight left in his stance, only the heaviness that comes after a storm you didn't ask for, but had to stand through. Nora stepped out onto the porch, the late sun catching the strands of hair that had escaped her braid. You think they'll be back? She asked. Maybe, he said. But that's tomorrow's trouble. He turned to her then, as if weighing something he'd been carrying for longer than he should have. My boy. He wants a mother, Caleb said quietly, his eyes not quite meeting hers. And your girl. She needs a home. Truth is, if she wants it, she's already got a father. The air between them seemed to stretch. Nora crossed her arms, but her gaze didn't waver. I don't belong to anyone, she said, the words steady, but not unkind unless I choose to. Caleb's jaw tightened, not with anger, but something closer to hope's last gamble. Then choose, he said simply. Nora's eyes softened just a touch, but she didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward the pasture where 2 small figures were busy near the riverbank. Ben and Cora were dragging driftwood and armfuls of dry grass, the laughter between them carrying in the breeze. By the time Caleb and Nora walked closer, the children had fashioned a crooked little lean-to, no taller than Ben's shoulder. What's this? Caleb asked, his voice roughened by something other than suspicion. A house, Ben said proudly, brushing dirt from his hands. For later. When we're grown. Cora nodded, grinning. So we can still be neighbors. Nora knelt to straighten a crooked branch in the wall. You think you'll still want to live next to each other in 10 years? She teased. Both children nodded, as if the idea were beyond question. Caleb watched them for a long moment, the sun laying a soft gold over the river and the small shelter they'd made. The current moved slow now, quiet against the bank, but he knew how quickly it could rise when the storms came. From behind him, Nora's voice was almost a whisper. They build like it's forever. Maybe that's how you start forever, Caleb said, his eyes still on the children. Nora didn't answer. The breeze lifted the edge of her skirt, the smell of mesquite and river mud mingling in the fading light. She looked at the lean-to again, 2 walls of driftwood, a roof patched with grass and hope, and for the first time in a long while, the thought of staying didn't feel like a cage. The next morning broke quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a hard wind, soft, watchful, holding its breath. A pale mist clung to the pecos curling along the banks like it meant to stay a while. From the open window of the small back room, Nora caught sight of movement by the corral. Caleb was crouched low near the fence, a length of leather cord looped in his calloused hands. Cora stood beside him, the toes of her boots digging into the damp earth. He spoke low and patient, showing her how to knot the line without letting it twist. She tried once, fumbled, tried again, and this time her small fingers found the shape he'd shown her. Like that paw, she asked without thinking. The word hung in the morning air, simple as sunlight. Caleb froze for just a fraction, then smiled, small, quiet, but deep enough to reach his eyes. Exactly like that, he said. Nora stayed at the window a moment longer, one hand on the sill, the other pressed against the steady beat in her chest. That night, the kitchen smelled of stew and warm bread. The 4 of them sat around the rough-hewn table, elbows bumping, spoons kinking against tin bowls. Ben told a story about chasing a calf that had more sense than he did. Cora added her version, which somehow involved a stagecoach and a runaway chicken. Nora laughed until her cheeks hurt, and even Caleb, who never wasted laughter, let it out in short, rumbling bursts. It wasn't perfect. The chairs didn't match. The bread was a little too dark on the edges, and the wind found its way through the chinks in the wall. But it was full of voices, of shared glances, of something that had been missing in all of them for too long. Later, after the dishes were stacked, and the children had wandered off to their makeshift fort by the riverbank, Nora stepped onto the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered thick over the dark line of the hills. The river whispered in the distance, the steady voice of a neighbor who'd seen it all and stayed anyway. Caleb was there, leaning against the railing. In his hand he held something small, a smooth stone shaped like a teardrop, its surface worn by years of water and time. A strip of leather cord threaded through a hole at its top. He turned it over in his palm once before speaking. "Found this in the river a long while back," he said. "Figured anything that can be carried that far and still hold together must be worth keeping." He looked at her, then eyes steady in the lamplight. "Will you let us be your home?" The question was plain, without decoration. No promises of forever, no gilded edges, just the offer of a place of hands that would hold steady when the current rose. Nora felt the answer before she spoke it. She nodded once, slow, the way you do when you were certain enough to stop running. Caleb stepped forward, slipped the cord into her hands. It wasn't a gold ring. There was no preacher waiting, no witnesses but the cottonwoods and the river. Just a choice, and her choosing to stay. They found the children under the wide arms of the cottonwood by the bank. Ben was pretending to fish with a stick. Cora was weaving wild grass into a crooked crown. The 4 of them sat together in the hush of early night, the cottonwood leaves rattling above the pecos, rolling on steady, unhurried shore. For the first time in a long while, none of them wondered where they belonged. Maybe you've stood somewhere before, looking around and wondering if you truly belonged there. Caleb and Nora took a long time to find that answer. Not through grand promises, but through simple suppers, hands ready to hold when the river rose, and the sound of children's laughter by the bank. If you've ever lost something, or thought you'd never find it again, remember this. Some homes aren't built from timber and nails, but from the choice to stay day after day. This story is just one among countless tales of the West, a land where the soil and the people can be unforgiving, yet hearts still find a way to soften. And maybe somewhere out there, there's a riverbank meant just for you. When you find it, I hope you'll have the courage to sit down and stay. If this tale found a place in your heart, hitch your wagon to this campfire by subscribing. There are more stories waiting beyond the ridge, and I'd be proud to ride with you to the next one.